Hopefully I'll be able to record this all the way through in one sitting, but I have somewhere I have to be in 20 minutes. I just wanted to get this down. A lot of good news coming out of GAFCON lately. A lot of people have pointed out and been very encouraged. I'm also very encouraged by what's called the Kigali Commitment, which is to Orthodox Anglicanism and basically represents 85% of the Anglican communion, which kind of, I think, is good at reorienting the global Anglican movement, reminding people that, especially in these inter-Christian debates with Catholics and Orthodox, that it's not really like you become Protestant and then you become progressive Christian, right? But there are other things to be talking about here that I think are more relevant within an intra-conservative Orthodox Christian perspective. I think a lot of people are kind of thinking of this in a fun way because it's kind of a weird mirror, except in a lot of ways better, of the first Reformation, right? There's the church center of authority in Canterbury, and there's lots of concerns from other bishops and faithful Christians about the direction that they're going in, and they're splitting off. A big part of the Kigali Commitment was basically that they reject the authority of the See of Canterbury just because of its location, and that actually it has more to do with doctrinal orthodoxy. And so in the original Reformation, Reformation 1, there was this kind of, we sever our connection to this institution because we want to maintain what we see as biblical orthodoxy, and that's definitely a plus. But there are also some minuses, and I think maybe something I want to put into the conversation, if I'm even capable of doing so, is that we should probably replace the See of Canterbury with a new Holy See of Anglicanism to prevent what ended up happening at the end of Reformation 1, where there was this kind of decentralized Protestant Reformation, which was mostly good, but then ended up, whatever Protestants think was worth it or not, I think the Protestant Reformation obviously was worth it. It gave kind of room and space for things like the Anabaptist movements and other movements that we did not want to encourage. And so we have to kind of keep this unity. Luther talks about this a lot. The Anglican Communion has dealt with this a lot. So we kind of really do want to positively put something into the place of the See of Canterbury that we can consistently expect to take that role of unity, of cooperation, and we don't want to replace it with a fracturing again. I think that would be a mistake. And so this gets into what kind of method is being expressed here. I think that the repeated motif of Christian history is this kind of recession and then a re-expansion into areas. And this comes up a lot of times with Redeemed Zoomer, who I have a lot of respect for. He has a great YouTube channel. You should check him out. He does lots of good opinions. He's in the PC USA, and he has this kind of idea that we should reconquest the mainline churches as conservative Christians in a similar way, right? He's using the word Reconquista a lot, which reminds us of the Spanish Reconquista, where the whole country was taken over by Muslims, and then the Christians took it back. And now, in a lot of ways, it's hard to think of Spain as nothing but a Christian country, despite this history. But what I think that this actually highlights when you study the history of the actual Reconquista is the necessity of building new institutions, building those up for the inevitable reconquest. The Reconquista in Spain was not done, and there are lots of stories of martyrs, of people on the ground in the Islamic caliphates of the area in Cordoba who died for the faith, gloriously of course, but they didn't reinstitute the Reconquista. What this was a concerted effort from Christian strongholds to reconquer from a place of strength, from something that was built, right? The Kingdom of Asturias is the example here in Spain. They take what was already built and they come back, they reconquered from a stronghold. And I think conservatives and Christians in general are much better at doing this, where we can build these strongholds and then operate out of them, versus, I think, what we'll hear Redeemed Zoomer say a lot is kind of this, the left wingers were very good at hijacking institutions they didn't build. Why can't we do the same thing? And I think it has a lot to do with attitude, with tactics, with engaging in things that we find unhelpful, or unchristlike. I got a comment on my video covering ContraPoints about how it shouldn't be seen as we should adopt ContraPoints' tactics because ContraPoints is doing them. Because what about our Christian duty? And that's totally true. As Christian followers, we're commanded to take up a whole new set of moral prohibitions on our tactics for evangelism. And that's totally true. And so because we have to keep those things, we can't employ the same strategies as what I've called in my past couple of videos, Nation A. Now, the sad part of this, it feels like now, is this kind of, well, what about all these beautiful churches? What about all these institutions? Redeemed Zoomer brings this up a lot, but these institutions like Harvard and Princeton were founded by mainland Protestants, and they have enormous power, they have enormous strength, and not to mention some beautiful churches. And nobody loves beautiful churches, liturgical space, material culture of Christianity more than I do. I mean, I have a whole video on it. But what we have to realize is that those things can be taken back. A lot of them, unfortunately, will and have been lost. I know a lot of churches in the Episcopal world are just being destroyed because they don't have congregants and they can't afford to uphold these historic churches, and it's very sad. And they would rather destroy them than give them to faithful Anglican communities, which are growing and which do have congregants, and it's a tragedy. But they're not, they're not stupid. I always want to point a lot of people, especially in the Anglican world, who have this Reconquista idea to the Bishop of Florida story, where there's the Diocese of Florida to this day in the Episcopal Church is a very conservative diocese. A lot of people point to it as, oh, look, you can be conservative in the Episcopal Church. But they have tried to elect, I think, like 8 times a conservative bishop who does not want to do gay marriages in the Episcopal Church, even despite the fact that in theory the Episcopal Church allows for a diversity of opinions on this. The higher ups in the Episcopal Church have denied his placement as Bishop of Florida because they see him as a homophobe and all these other things, and you just can't play in that terrain on even footing because they're not stupid. They hijacked this whole operation in the beginning, and they're not going to let us do the same thing. They've learned from their mistakes. In the Episcopal Church, there are whole boards and committees devoted to DEI, to left-wing promotion of political agendas, to promoting things like Planned Parenthood. It's been institutionalized in a way that the church was not previously institutionalized against liberal hijacking. However, there is a history that we have been able to do this in the past. I'm going to go out of order a little bit, but in the SBC and the LCMS, lots of people point out there was a very successful resistance to this hijacking. And they have a good infrastructure, I think. From what I hear, there's some concern in the LCMS from some Orthodox people that it's kind of coming back. Same thing in the SBC. But what they have is an infrastructure of preservation, which is vital to stopping this from happening again. And when we build these new institutions, like GAFCON, like the new Anglican Communion, we kind of have to build into them this resistance ability to change, which was not necessary before. And so as we have this building flexibility, when we start something from the ground up, we can build it with these considerations. I'm going to go out of order now again. But what the Puritans did, and a lot of Reformed people did when they were rebuilding new institutions in America, that were inherently supposed to be puritanical and Christian and doctrinally, in their opinion, orthodox, is that they built things in to these societies so in depth, so pervasively, that when people disagreed with Puritan orthodoxy, that was how Rhode Island was founded, right? The surrounding New English culture was so endemically doctrinally orthodox because they had experienced English Christianity fall away from that they wanted to build into a new society resistance against kind of doctrinal confusion. And they were able to do that for a long time. And I think we have to kind of look at that as a model. I think, again, re-Christianization is such a unique sphere of evangelism that is not the same as purely Christianization. I love the story of early English re-Christianization, right? Because when the Romans conquered Britain, Christianity was brought with them in that period. And then it kind of goes away after the Anglo-Saxon invasion. And so what a lot of Irish monks had to do when they reconquisted England, and at the time what was called Britain, is that they had to rebuild. They didn't appeal to, in a lot of ways, previous institutions. They didn't go to these states, these kingdoms, and integrate themselves instantly. They wouldn't have been allowed to. The Anglo-Saxons had just fought battles with Christians and conquered this whole country and conquered their kingdoms. They were looking out for this kind of resistance. And so what monks like St. Aidan of Lindisfarne did is they built monastic communities, new ones, in new spaces, and worked with an era of their own Asturias, their own space that they could go back into and then start relations with leaders and with communities in the pagan Britain to slowly reconvert them in a Reconquista model. That's what the Reconquista really is. It's not a bottom up converting the laity, and then the laity will kind of, cast their aspersions upward. It's this kind of relationship between two powers, and one power overcomes the other. And that's kind of what we have to do here. I think if you look at the history of Anglicanism, and I hope I can do a series on this later, but if you look at the history of Anglicanism, when the Puritans are taken out of power during the Restoration, there's this period called the Clarendon Code, and there's the Act of Uniformity passed, and what it was meant to do was to counter, in order to counter both Catholics on one side who wanted to return England to Rome, and on the other side, these dissenters, there was this very strict, conscious act of uniformity, which said, here's where we're setting the boundaries on either side to stop dissenters and to stop Catholics. And what we kind of have to do is the same. However, the advantage that the restorers had in this period was it was obvious to those who lived during the period of the English Civil War and the Puritan rule that their political scheme, their religious scheme, it just didn't work. And so the conservative reaction to that had this kind of, blank check to do what they needed to do, right? The king was restored, lots of nobility was restored and regranted, and there was a political reshaping of society in such a fundamental way that they had this kind of flexibility. Now, on the other hand, there was kind of this reaction to the reaction where Puritans who had outlawed dancing and all holidays and were very strict and dour. So then this period is not necessarily known as one that is defined by Christian piety. It's defined by kind of licentiousness. Charles II is infamous not for being a devout Anglican, but as having been someone who was more of a reaction to Puritanism than anything else. He's called the Merry Monarch because he had lots of adulterous affairs. He had all these things. He's certainly no George III, if you know a lot about Anglican history and the monarchy. There's things we have to watch out for on both sides as we rebuild, and I think an element of that is kind of saying we're going to retreat, right? What did Charles II do after his dad was beheaded and he had to go across? He lived in another country with his court. He held court regularly. He basically pretended to be the monarch of England until it was his time to return, and he brought with him nobility. He brought with him institutions. He yes, did a lot of restoration. That's literally what this period is called. But he also did a lot of building. Before the English Civil War, there was no need for the Clarendon Code. There was no need for the Act of Uniformity, because it hadn't become an issue yet, and new institutions, new fundamentals of organization were necessary for this Reconquista. And that's basically my general critique of the Reconquista movement and my encouraging advice, because I really do agree with the goals and the theory behind the Reconquista. All right. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment if you have an opinion, if you disagree, if you agree. I usually interact with people in the comments if they have something to say. All right. Thank you.